In the next part of our lecture, we are primarily talking about the developmental sequence of catching, but we can't talk about catching without also discussing how anticipation changes in relation to the interception of whatever is being catched. So, catching is the most common manipulative skill in relation to sport play, and it involves gaining possession or control of a moving object by intercepting or stabbing it with an implement or the hands. So usually the anticipation and coordination of the interception component is what makes catching difficult. In a way, it requires a more developed sensory and perceptual skills in addition to gross and fine motor skills to achieve this action successfully. When we look at characteristics of novices or early catching, usually performers are more likely to display rigid arms and hands. So this is very similar to the ballistic and locomotor skill progressions that we've observed over the last couple of weeks. But this would also mean there's less movement variability in terms of the utilized degrees of freedom. So again, we see this kind of freezing strategy to improve stability. The objects being caught are also usually against the body, which leads to little force absorption because there's no flexing of the arms to kind of dissipate the distance across which the force is being absorbed or which the impact is occurring. Also typical of early catching is that the eyes will close and the head will turn away from the projectile object. This is more or less part of the startle reflex, which functions for protecting vital organs such as the brain. And our vision, we're very dependent on our eyes for a lot of things. So that's usually a resulting behavior, which can impact accuracy of the catch, because if they turn their head away, then they lose sight of where the object is in space. More proficient catching, you'll see that the hands give with the ball to gradually absorb force. So once the hands make contact, usually the elbows will flex in towards the body to dissipate more forceful impact. So you'll notice this more if there's a heavy object being thrown. Not quite as much with smaller objects. With this one, I think the impact with the ground is a good example of how flexing the arms would help to absorb force across a greater distance, but that's more of a catching motion of body weight and not a catching motion of the projectile object, even though it's how he's adjusting his body position. But speaking of adjusting a body position, there is an increased ability to move the body to intercept the object being caught in various ways. We also notice a differentiation of hand position for catching, so usually projected items in a higher range in relation to body height. Typically, those would end up with the fingers pointing upwards, and then lower catches would have the fingers pointing downwards. When we look at the developmental changes in catching, sometimes it can be difficult to identify developmental sequences simply because the movement pattern is very dependent on the conditions under which the task is performed. So in general, we can observe arm action, hand action, and body action and kind of delve out which stages a person might be in, but we take this with a little bit of a grain of salt just because if we're observing a video and we're not privy to what the task constraints were or task instructions were, that could potentially influence what developmental sequences we see. But also if we have a person throwing an object to a child, for example, The consistency of that throw is also going to be important. So if the throw is off center of the child and they don't have, let's say, the ability to adjust their body, that's going to make it look like they're at a lot lower level than they might be. But the main point here is to highlight that task and environmental constraints can greatly affect task difficulty and the sequences observed. So task constraints in catching might include ball size, shape, trajectory, and arrival point in relation to the catcher. And then environmental constraints could be physical, either relating to like gravity, weather, or the type of surface the person is catching on. They could also be socially or culturally related. So very similar to throwing, catching movement sequences are usually higher in males compared to females, just because boys usually play more ball sports than females, thus they have more experience. So let's look at each of these body actions one by one. The catching is what you're going to be observing in your activity this week. So hopefully doing a deep dive into all of these developmental sequences is helpful in helping you develop a better eye for these movement patterns. So the setup of this slide is pretty similar to our previous lectures, where we've got the developmental sequence listed in the table, and then we've got our observational plan flowchart, which has questions that we can use to help us figure out what developmental step someone might be at. So the first question we ask when looking at arm action is, do the arms move to adapt to ball arrival? If the answer is no, then the individual is at step 1, which we say is little response. I love this video. I apologize for laughing. Let me turn off my laser pointer really quick. But step 1, I'll just play this video through so you can see. I feel horrible for laughing. Anyways, so I'm going to drag this through. Do the arms move to adapt to ball arrival? No, they do not. Okay, we do see a little bit of extension of the arms towards the ball. It's very delayed, but she's not moving her arms to actually adapt to the ball arrival. If we do see an adaptation to the ball, usually there is a meek attempt to trap the ball against the chest, but typically pretty unsuccessful. Okay. If we answered yes to this previous question, so the arms do adapt to ball arrival, then we look to see if the ball is trapped against the chest or if it's caught in the hands. If it's trapped against the chest, then we look at how the trapping is happening. So are the arms hugging or moving in a sideways direction around the ball? Or is there more of a scooping action where the arms go under the ball? This video is going to be an example of what hugging looks like, and it's a very, very nuanced difference between hugging and scooping. So I think looking at a hand-facing direction can typically be helpful. So usually people who have a hugging arm action will also have a palms facing inward action, and we haven't gotten to hand actions yet, but that'll make more sense when we look at some examples there. Scooping, the hands or the palms are usually facing more upwards. So I think that's the best way to distinguish these two. But in this video, okay, we see the boy catching the ball. I'm going to pause it. Initially, you see his palms facing upward, but the arm action we're interested in is when they actually contact the ball. So if I drag us through the video, upon contact, you can see his palms actually end up facing inwards, which would be more characteristic of a hugging response. in the arms. Okay, and if we progress through the video further, you see that like enveloping in that outward circular motion a little bit better. If we have more of a scooping action, or step 3 in our developmental sequence, looks kind of like that. Okay. So we can see as the ball is approaching her, her palms face upwards, right, just before contact, and then the ball is trapped against her chest with a scooping type movement pattern. For the last developmental stage, this would be if the ball makes contact with the hands instead of being trapped against the chest. So we call this step arms give. This would be a good example, right? So the ball makes direct contact with her hands, not being trapped against the chest. Now we can turn our direction towards hand action. So this is primarily considering how the palms are facing in relation to the object. The first question we ask is, do the palms face inward? If the answer is no, so either the palms are facing up or down, then we have a step 1 classification in our developmental sequence. In this particular example, we can see as she tries to move towards the ball, her palms are facing down. Usually, if we see palms facing down, it's typically observed when catching rolling balls. So if the ball was on the ground, the palms would be facing downwards to catch the ball as it rolls towards them. For her, her palms are facing down because she kind of uses a swatting motion with her arms. But more typical of catching action, step 1 is usually going to exhibit a palm facing upward kind of motion, but it could be either or. If you answered yes to this first question and the palms are facing inwards, we then ask the question, do the hands adjust to the flight path and the size of the ball? So either the fingers are pointing upwards for high-level catches or the fingers are pointing downwards for low-level catches. If the answer is no, the palms are inward. Okay, and again, usually inward-facing palms are going to be associated with a step 2 hugging action of the arms. In step 3, we'll see that the hands will adjust to the flight path and the size of the ball. So in this example, right, hands aren't maybe one hand is facing one direction. I think the background contrast is a little bit difficult, but one palm is facing inwards while the other palm is facing more towards her front-facing direction. Right, so there's a bit more of a differentiation between what each hand is doing to best adjust to the flight path of the ball so that the catch can be successfully performed. The other action we're interested in observing is body action. So the first question we ask is, does the body move to adjust to the flight of the ball? If the answer is no, we're in step 1 of the developmental sequence, which is just defined as no adjustment. Clearly, no adjustment. I love that video. Okay, if we have step 2, so yes, the body does move to adjust to the flight of the ball, then we have to look at the timing. So if the adjustment is delayed to make a more accurate movement, we call that delayed adjustment. If the catcher tries to move too prematurely and it kind of looks awkward, so like the arms and trunk move in relation to the ball's flight path, but maybe their head remains upright and their movement towards the ball or the object being caught is kind of awkward, then that would be a step 2. Unfortunately, the book doesn't, or the textbook publisher, they don't provide an example of a step 2 catching movement, so we don't really have one to show, but we can compare this to what a delayed adjustment would look like with this video, right? So you can see that she's still adjusting her body movements all the way up until she actually catches the ball. Okay, so if we were in a step 2, they'd make the adjustment, maybe it's there, and then they do an additional like awkward reach with the arms. But in this case, the body is moving all the way up until the point of contact, so that would be considered a delayed adjustment, which in this case, the delay is good because it improves the catching accuracy.